Thank you so much, Emily, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm going to be presenting some new work today, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback as this is early in the project and there's a lot of room for development. So please, lots of feedback. So the title today is The Political Protection of Privilege, How Land Use Regulations Preserve Exclusivity. This work is joint with one of my undergraduates. Her name is Lindsay Sanchez, and she did a tremendous amount of work preparing the data for this analysis. So she is definitely a true co-author here. So you all know, race and class segregation in America dramatically affect individuals' well-being over their life course. And many of the people in this room have contributed to the knowledge in this area that we know that this is a fact. Despite a great deal of research on segregation, the political processes that create and perpetuate the division of communities along race and class lines is not well understood, mostly because the majority of work on segregation has not been produced by political scientists. This is a failure of my field, sort of generally speaking. Yet we know that land use regulations do play a role in generating segregation. In the United States, the development of land use regulations are the exclusive purview of local governments. This is the second reason why we don't know much about the political processes that generate segregation. The study of local politics has long been seen as less consequential than the study of national politics in the field of political science. In regulating the use of land, cities can dictate what, if anything, gets built, how those buildings will be used, the quality of buildings, and what they'll look like. But most importantly, for my purposes today, land use regulations specify the precise location of development. At the parcel level, cities can determine the housing that will be permitted on any particular piece of land. And while it might seem intuitive that government's land use authority would play a role in generating and maintaining segregation, the links remain a little bit fuzzy. Scholars have shown that cities and metro areas with more stringent land use regulations and those with more restrictions on density are more segregated. But these results are driven by aggregate data, right? The whole city has more restrictive zoning. And so the whole city is more segregated than a neighboring city or another city that has less restrictive zoning and is less segregated. While it might seem that it's the most privileged, whitest neighborhoods that would have the most stringent land use regulations, we don't actually have evidence in support of this assumption. On the other hand, research focused on the drivers of segregation has largely focused on individual choices in the search for housing. Scholars highlight vast differences in wealth across racial groups and preferences for living among same-race neighbors. But for individual decisions to cause residential segregation along racial lines, it must also be the case that housing affordability and or housing types are also segregated. We need to link these bodies of work, right? The segregation of housing affordability and housing types are land use decisions. So we need to study the decisions that local governments make. I hope you all recognize these pictures. They're just for you. The segregation of housing types is predominantly achieved in the 21st century by using land use regulations to disallow multifamily or high density development in favor of low density single family homes in certain neighborhoods or even in the entire city overall. The classic conception of local politics as being dominated by growth and development interests does not predict this outcome. So again, we need research that can explain how this political process has come to be. A brief look at any city's zoning map or land use map shows you that there is evidence that land use designations do in fact segregate housing types, thereby segregating housing affordability. And what you can see here on the left is a land use map from Princeton. This is old, it's from 1996. I couldn't find a more updated one. And so it could be that they haven't changed their zoning map since 1996, or they just don't put it on the internet. You can see the sort of dark brown cluster of parcels in the center of Princeton here is where the highest density development is permitted by right. In Trenton, on the right-hand side of your screen up there, the vast majority of Trenton permits by right development of multifamily or higher density development, except for that little cluster of very light yellow parcels up on the upper left-hand side. So what you're seeing here is two types of segregation. You see segregation within the city of Princeton, right? The high density development only permitted in the center of the city and lower density development surrounding that. But you can also see the difference in segregation patterns between these cities. Overall, Trenton has much more high density development, much more multifamily development than Princeton does. So we need to take into account both types of segregation patterns when we're exploring the political processes. I'm actually going to ignore the Trenton and Princeton relationship for a lot of my talk today, but I have data and I can talk about it if it's of interest to people. We argue that neighborhoods that are home to concentrated populations of socioeconomically privileged residents use their political power in the land use process to generate, protect, and entrench their exclusivity by maintaining low density zoning in their neighborhoods. We explain in the paper that there are several reasons why wealthy white neighborhoods would seek to use the land use process in this way. They build wealth, they can limit congestion, and they can shape the income and racial composition of the residents who live in their community. I have other work that explores whether one or other of these mechanisms are dominant. And essentially what I find is that they're all equally powerful motivators for seeking low density housing. In the early part of the 20th century, white wealthy neighborhoods sought to bar immigrants, people of color, and the poor from living near them. This is not a new story, but they relied heavily on private mechanisms like restrictive covenants to achieve their goals. City governments came into play here, right, by placing railroads or highways across certain neighborhoods. But the use of zoning in this particular way is a rather modern invention. To better understand the degree to which the exclusion of multifamily homes changed over time, we digitized zoning maps from San Francisco. I should say, Lindsay digitized zoning maps from San Francisco from 1929, 1968, 1980, and 2021. And what you can see here is that all the way up past 1980, the vast majority of parcels in San Francisco were zoned for the possibility of multifamily development. That does not mean that most of San Francisco has multifamily development. It doesn't. Most of San Francisco is single family homes. But it was permissible for a landowner to sell their parcel and for a developer to build a multi-unit house or a multi-unit development on a particular parcel for most of the latter half of this century, of the last century. In 2021, you can see that this has changed. About 35% of parcels in San Francisco, this is all parcels, not just residential parcels, but about 35% of all parcels in San Francisco are today zoned for single family, low density use only. The development of land use regulations and zoning maps is an intensely political process. Cities hold public hearings to gather the input of residents. An appointed planning commission makes recommendations, and ultimately, the elected officials of the city are responsible for adopting plans. For most large cities, zoning maps were developed somewhere between 1920 and 1970. And as cities grew and developed, these zoning maps and the codes that regulate them were adjusted and amended over time. As a result, I argue, we should think of land use regulations that govern the parcels in any city as an accumulation of past political choices. And we argue that these choices ought to favor politically powerful constituents, who we have identified in this paper as white, wealthy property owners. So our task is to identify neighborhoods that have markers of privilege before the dramatic increase in restrictive zoning. We could use neighborhood demographic information such as race and homeowner status as correlates of privilege, But even measures like the racial makeup and homeownership status do not always capture the nuanced differences across neighborhoods. You can all think of neighborhoods where the racial makeup or the sort of housing type makeup is roughly similar, and yet you still think of one neighborhood as somewhat better than that other neighborhood, right? We need on the ground information about the privileged places. Broad data on the presence of restricted covenants does not exist, and the census did not record household income until 1970 in a substantial way. So instead, we turn to another data source, a set of maps that were produced by the federal government's Homeowners Loan Corporation that detailed neighborhood conditions in 211 communities across the United States. And what you see here is one of these maps, and I'm sure you've all seen these a million times. These are the famous, have been called redlining maps, although there's problems with that designation, which I'm happy to talk about. These maps show the credit risk for different neighborhoods that the government would face when they refinance loans in these particular places. So in the aftermath of the Great Depression, the federal government was launching a series of programs to spur construction and development in the home building industry. And the job of HOLC was to refinance mortgages that had gone into foreclosure. So as part of the program, HOLC created this set of maps that described the credit risk for different neighborhoods across the United States. They generally are sort of early representations of metropolitan areas. There's a central city and then some surrounding cities for most of the maps that HOLC created. We're going to use these maps to provide a historical snapshot of exclusivity. If land use regulations protect privilege like we say that they should, we should find that neighborhoods that were rated more highly by HOLC should work to defend their exclusivity through more stringent land use regulations today. So a couple of years ago, there's an organization a planning organization in the Bay Area called the Association of Bay Area Governments. Their acronym is ABAG. We don't have to comment. ABAG's role is to support all of the cities in the Bay Area in developing what is called their housing element. In California, the state government requires that every city plan for a certain number of new units of housing. The number of units is handed down by the state government. The state says, San Francisco, you need to plan for building 3,000 market rate units. You need to plan for 6,000 below market rate units, et cetera. And all the cities in California go, oh yeah, we know. And then they don't do it. So the state has recently gotten more heavy-handed in their willingness to tell cities that if they don't plan for new housing, that they're going to lose funding in various ways. This process requires cities every 5 years in California to produce this ginormous report called a housing element, which details all of the zoning regulations in their city and identifies at the parcel level where development for new housing can happen. Cities have all sorts of sneaky ways to get around this. So there's a city in the Central Valley right near where I live, where their favorite tactic is to say that this entire very large portion of their city is going to be zoned for high density development. The problem is that very large portion of their city happens to be owned by the state of California and is the dorms for Fresno State. So it's implausible that we're going to tear down the dorms at Fresno State and build a bunch of high density apartments there. But nonetheless, Clovis continues to argue that this is where they're going to build high density development. ABAG as an institution wants to help cities actually build higher density housing. And so they have at one of the pieces of the housing element that is required as of since 2015 is that not only do cities have to plan for new development, they have to have land use regulations that support that development. They also have to pay attention to the current levels of segregation in their community, both racial segregation, income segregation, and disability segregation in the city. And ABAG approached me and said, we have no idea how to do this, can you help? And I said, yes. And so I created segregation maps for all of the cities in the Bay Area with some historical analysis of how segregation in all the Bay Area cities have changed over time. In exchange for this work that I did, ABAG gave me parcel level zoning designations for every parcel in the Bay Area in order to produce this work. That's where I have these data from. So this data is a partnership with ABAG and MTC. And as of 2021, we have the parcel level zoning information for every parcel in the Bay Area of California. And we're confident that these data are correct because there are real consequences to not having the right zoning designation at the parcel level for the cities themselves. We have three variables. We know whether every parcel is designated as residential or non-residential. We know whether or not every parcel is designated as having by right multifamily development or not. And finally, we know the maximum dwelling units per acre that is allowed on every parcel. I could talk for a long time about max DUA, but it's really boring. The shorter version is that max DUA is the best predictor of segregation in California. What this means is how many units can you stick on a parcel that is an acre in size? An acre parcel that is designated with a max DUA of 7 is the typical single family max DUA in California. So 7 units per acre parcel in California is normal. There are cities where most of the city is zoned with a max DUA of 2. That's half acre parcels, half acre houses only, right? And there are other places where they're permitting more high density single family development, upwards of 15 houses per acre. So max DUA, although complicated and a little hard to follow, is actually a really important indicator of a city's willingness or the city's regulatory capacity for building higher density housing, regardless of whether or not that parcel is zoned for multifamily or non-multifamily use. As I mentioned before, these are the primary, these variables capture the primary mechanism that produces segregation in the United States today, which is the capacity for a parcel to be developed at high density or not. Using GIS, we joined the parcel data with the whole neighborhood grades from the map that I showed you previously. Green is the best, blue is still desirable, yellow is definitely declining, and red is hazardous. And if you haven't had a chance to go through the Hulk maps, it's a wonderful treasure trove of information about every neighborhood that they map. They describe in detail all the reasons why they give the ratings that they do for each of the neighborhoods. And it's great to understand what the thinking was behind these designations. So they'll say, largely covered by restrictive covenants, no chance of racial transition happening here, right? And so this is what we think of as the best indicator from on the ground information of where the exclusive neighborhoods were in the United States. We also joined 1940 census tract data, the share of housing units that were existing single family homes, median home value, and the share of the population that was white in 1940. We think of these as important measures, additional measures of historical exclusivity, and important measures of the existing land use that was in place at the time when land use regulations began to be developed. We argue that residents of privileged areas use land use regulations to lock in their status. And we're going to build this argument in several steps. This paper is a piece of a book project where there's going to be even more steps to building the argument, hopefully someday in like a decade. Essentially, we begin with the expectation that higher Holt grades will predict more exclusive zoning today. They should be more likely to remain residential. Those neighborhoods should be more likely to be zoned single family as opposed to multifamily, and they should be more likely to be zoned for low density development. Second, we expect that these exclusive land use designations will correlate with higher socioeconomic status today, that these neighborhoods will be whiter, they will be wealthier, they will have more homeowners, etc. And finally, we expect that in the aggregate, housing type segregation in the zoning code will be associated with race and class segregation within cities. And I'm also going to show you some data within school districts. And as I've been telling everybody I've been meeting with today, this is my first dabble into the school literature. So I know very little. I would love to hear your feedback on how this is going. So most of you are very familiar with measures of segregation, but it's important, I think, to reiterate that what I'm doing is moving between levels, right? I am predicting the relationship between zoning and demographics at the micro level, at the neighborhood level, and then I am aggregating those data to segregation measures and predicting the segregation of housing type between neighborhoods and using the segregation of housing type between neighborhoods to predict segregation, race and class segregation between neighborhoods and between schools and school districts. So here is what we do first. What you can see here, and hopefully the variables or the data aren't too small, the neighborhoods that were rated higher by Hulk have different land use designations as of 2021. These communities were more likely to be zoned for residential use. What that means, and I just want to back up and say, the Hulk maps only cover, they're only designating residential areas. So what this tells us is that there were neighborhoods that were designated as red and yellow by Hulk that got converted to commercial use over time. The places that were most likely to remain residential were the blue and green Hulk neighborhoods, right? So they were less likely to be converted to industrial, commercial, and other uses over time. These blue and green neighborhoods are also less likely to be zoned for multifamily development. And this is extremely significant, given that in 2021, only about 1.5% of all parcels in the Bay Area, 1.5% of parcels are zoned for multifamily use. Finally, these parcels are zoned today at lower densities, with approximately 2 fewer dwelling units per acre at each Hulk grade. The median max density in this data set is 12 dwelling units per acre. And so a single dwelling unit per acre increase is a meaningful increase here. Okay, there's a lot going on here. Next, we're going to use our 2 residential land use variables, the multifamily designation of the parcel and the max density, which has been rescaled here to run from 0 to 1, to predict the demographics of neighborhoods, both across cities and within cities. And what I'm showing you here is only the data within cities. And what I have here are, so I have fixed effects for cities included in this analysis. So we're looking at how does the zoning designation of parcels within cities affect the block group demographics within cities. We gathered data from the 2015-2019 American Community Survey at the census block group level, and then merged these to the parcel data described in the previous section. So we're regressing the block group percent white, an entropy measure of diversity, the percent that are renters, the percent of residents below the poverty line, the share of housing units that are single family, the median home values, and the number of new housing permits that were issued in that particular neighborhood over the last 5 years. So what you can see is that higher zoned density and multifamily designations are associated with more diversity, fewer white residents, more renters, more residents living below the poverty line. These regulations are also associated with fewer single family homes, lower median home values, and newer housing permits. What this tells you, this last piece here, this new housing permits regression, shows that this is likely to persist, right? So even now, the developmental pipeline is such that new housing and new development is only occurring in these places where there's higher zone density and multifamily zoning. So this is a regulation story, right? This is a story about how regulations affect the demographics of communities going forward.
That's good.
Yeah.
What's the reference group here?
The reference group for?
What's left? Which group is left out?
There's not, so max density is a continuous variable.
Okay.
And multifamily is just a dummy variable for whether the parcel is multifamily or not, right? So the reference group for multifamily is single family, and the max density runs from, what's the minimum? 2. Yeah, you can't have a parcel. That's not true. There are 1 acre parcels. There's not smaller than 1 acre in this data set. Although there are in California, this is gonna take me on a tangent, but I'll tell you anyway. There are places in California, and for those of you who've been to California, there's a very exclusive community called Los Altos Hills, which it's like Los Altos, but even fancier. And the entire city of Los Altos Hills is zoned as agricultural land. There's not a farm in sight in Los Altos Hills, but being zoned agricultural under California state law allows you to have zoning designations so that you can have 1 housing unit for every 2 to 4 acres. So that's what they have. 1 housing unit on their 2-acre property. Los Altos Hills. So those end up getting dropped here because there are too few of them to have the city fix effects. Okay. So what this means is that in the aggregate, cities that apply different development standards to different parcels should have both segregated housing types and segregated populations. And this is exactly what we find. We build several measures of segregation using the parcel and census data that I talked about just a minute ago. Our main independent variable is a measure of the degree to which neighborhoods are zoned for multifamily homes are separated from neighborhoods that are zoned for single family homes. I would like to do better at this, but this is what I've got right now. The reason why I would like to do better at it is because, first of all, there are so few parcels zoned for multifamily homes that there's just not a lot of variation within some cities. And in some cities, there's literally no variation because they have no parcels that are zoned for multifamily homes. As of 2021, this is less of a problem because even the most exclusive cities in California now have to show some evidence that they've zoned for multifamily development, but literally it could be like 4 parcels right on the main street where nobody would ever build a house. So if you give me feedback on other ways to think about measuring housing type segregation, I would love to hear it. But right now, what I've got is this a measure of entropy. It begins with a measure of entropy, the share of neighborhoods that are zoned for multifamily homes. So I calculate entropy at the neighborhood level and at the school level and at the city level and at the district level. And the pi sub t is just the share of parcels with residential zoning type T. The higher the entropy, the more diverse a particular neighborhood or a particular school catchment zone area is, right? So if you have a higher E, it means that you have a mixture of multifamily and single family designated parcels in that particular community. Then we use the entropy scores to build tiles H, which measures the difference between the housing type zoning at the city level and then the weighted average mix of housing type zoning of individual neighborhoods. And we do the same for school districts as the larger area and school catchment zones as the smaller area to produce these zoning indices. And I'm calling this zoning segregation. Again, I'd love your feedback on whether or not that's a catchy term, whether or not it makes any sense. I don't know what to call it. Zoning type segregation. And we produce the tiles H index for race and class segregation as well. And we calculate for race and class segregation, we're just using very basic measures here. Racial segregation is just white residents versus people of color or students of color in the school catchment zone school case. For class segregation, we have a more complicated metric, which is the share of individuals earning different area median percentages of the area median income. So we have the lowest income group is 50% of the area median income, those earning between 50 and 80%, those earning between 80 and 120%, and those earning 120% or more of the AMI. And for schools, I have a very blunt measure, which is the share of students that are socioeconomically disadvantaged in the school. Okay. And what you can see here is that segregating the type of housing across neighborhoods is positively, significantly associated with segregation along both race and class lines. I found it interesting. I usually don't point out the R squared of my regressions, but there's a lot of the variation that is being explained in these models, more than I usually find in my segregation analyses. So zoning segregation appears to predict a lot of what is going on in terms of income and racial segregation at the neighborhood level. I would also someday like to have similar data for more metropolitan areas so that I could do an analysis of a similar analysis of zoning segregation between cities, in addition to the zoning analysis within cities. Here are the data for schools. So multifamily zoning segregation also predicts income segregation, school to school, and racial segregation from school to school. And this makes sense, obviously, intuitively, right? We know that when neighborhoods are homogeneously white or homogeneously Black, the neighborhood school that is associated with those communities is also going to be homogeneously white and homogeneously Black. Obviously, there are things that school districts try to do to disrupt those patterns, but the primary driver of racial segregation in schools for a long time, scholars have told me, I haven't told them, that has been neighborhood segregation, right? And this is why we've become, our schools are resegregated today.
There's only 132 schools.
There are 132 school districts in the Bay Area. There are, I forget how many schools, several thousand. These are elementary schools. I should have said that too. The school data are really complicated, right? Because the catchment zones are overlapping for the different kinds of schools. So I first subset only to elementary schools here. And then I captured the parcels that are associated with each catchment zone for the elementary schools within each school district. And the school district story is in and of itself interesting, you know, that Doug is referencing here. School district, you should notice there are more school districts than there are cities. There are 108 cities in the Bay Area and 132 school districts. Why is that? Because there are several cities in the Bay Area where residents have lobbied to have their own school districts, even though they don't match up with the city boundaries. San Jose, where I grew up, is one of these places. And when San Jose was developing massively in the 1950s and 60s and growing like gangbusters, incorporating new areas, one of the big movements that happened in San Jose at this time was to push the state government to allow them to split up their school districts. So the remaining San Jose Unified School District is only runs down the center of San Jose, and all these wealthy outerlying areas are all different school districts. So the difference between school districts here is just as important as the difference between schools within the school districts. I just don't have enough data to analyze that, right? If I made my larger category the county, I would have 8. So an N of 8 is probably inappropriate someday. Yet, we still don't really know how these land use regulation patterns get enacted. So in some new work that isn't included in the paper that I mostly presented here, we turn to one possible source of segregationist choices. That is planning commissions. The planning process differs from city to city, but generally large decisions like the adoption of zoning maps and general plans are approved by elected officials, while day-to-day management and implementation of land use is handled by bureaucratic staff. In every city in California, an appointed body, the Planning Commission, plays an intermediate role in the process. So they take recommendations from the planning staff, they make their own determination, and then they make a recommendation to the city council. The Planning Commission is required by statute in California to hold public hearings on any major decision. There are some minor decisions they don't have to hold public hearings on, but every major decision. So it is the public's venue for saying what they want to say about land use decisions. And there's been a lot of work recently showing that the people who show up to Planning Commission meetings are not demographically representative of the population at large. But what we're doing here is looking at the planning commissioners. So if the planning commissioners are making these decisions, how are they, or whether or not they're representative of the cities as a whole? Planning commission approval is required for different kinds of permits, conditional use permits, and variances in the vast majority of cities in the Bay Area. So we gathered the names of all 598 Bay Area planning commissioners and matched them to a proprietary voter file that tells us the individual demographics of everybody in the voter file. And if you're from California, I can look you up. tell you all about your history of voting. And I, of course, looked up everybody I know. What you can see here is that the planning commissioners, and we lose a little bit of data because there are some planning commissioners that there are either too many people with that same name in the voter file, or they weren't registered to vote, which is illegal, but some of them are not registered to vote. So the planning commissioners are whiter, more likely to be male, more likely to be Democrats as opposed to independents. I don't want you thinking that there are Republicans in the Bay Area, because there aren't. The category here that's most important is the gap between independents and other. And they're older than Bay Area registered voters, and they are much, much more likely to be homeowners, which then is unsurprising why they make the kinds of decisions that they do. We predict that the probability, what we do is we match the planning commissioners to their neighborhoods. And what we find is that neighborhoods with higher zoned density are significantly less likely to have planning commission representation. What this means is that an important veto player in the planning process, city planning commissioners, are both demographically unlike the larger community, and they tend to live in neighborhoods that have much more stringent development regulations than the region as a whole. We don't yet know what they're doing with that power. We're collecting the massive data set right now of planning commissioner decisions. I'm in the process, or about to field a big survey of planning commissioners and planning staff. We're trying to really get to the bottom, really uncover what are the political decisions that are being made here. But right now, all I can tell you is that there seems to be a pattern we haven't yet explained at all. So segregation generates inequalities between race and class groups. And that has meant that the benefits experienced by racial and ethnic minorities and low-income individuals are inferior to the city benefits that are experienced by whites and the wealthy. When segregation persists, we see vast inequalities in everything from schools to safe streets to drinking water, which is in the news right now. But we're still learning exactly how segregation is generated. If segregation were merely the result of individual preferences for living in different communities, as Thibault famously suggested, we might not even think that this was worthy of study. If that were the case, we would be asking, why do poor families choose to live in neighborhoods with failing schools, lead in the water, broken sidewalks, and high crime rates, which is obviously on its face absurd. Segregation was built by public policy. It is maintained by public policy. These are not the preferences of the segregated. These are the preferences of the segregators. Understanding how the segregators capture and maintain the power to make this policy is essential to building a better world. And this paper is just one tiny step toward trying to figure that out.